Hello, everyone. Welcome to Analytics Unplugged, where we dive into the world of data-driven insights and explore how experts are using analytics to transform their industries. Today, we have a special guest with us, Susie Weinstein. She is a seasoned brand strategist and consumer insights expert, and also founder and principal of Driven Inc. We're thrilled to have her on the show to discuss the power of data in shaping brand perception and the journey toward true customer centricity. Welcome, Susie.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. So I just kind of want to dive right into the conversation. So to start, Susie, could you tell us a little bit about your perspective on how businesses traditionally think about brand strategy compared to how customers actually experience brands?
Yeah. So in companies, I think a lot of the time we think of things through business-oriented lenses, paid, owned, earned media, or channel-specific like retail, social, web. But, in the real world, and we know this as consumers, that's not really how people view brands. So I feel to become more customer-centric, we want to develop our data-driven strategies and ultimately our brands in a way that aligns with how people will perceive them in real life.
All right, so that makes a lot of sense, but I want to know is how do brands move away from this traditional approach to become more customer-centric?
It's a really good question. I think it's important to use multiple different sets or types of data when building your data-driven strategies, and to do this with your teammates, a lot of collaboration. The first step really is to think creatively about the sources you use when you're aggregating multiple sources of data. It helps you identify consistent themes, it helps you build a nuanced view of performance, and it helps you set common goals in a customer experience set of touch points. So the process of knowing what to do and where to start is going to vary. Generally, the types of data you'd have are qualitative, quantitative, and what I like to call cultural landscape. Cultural landscape can be really, a creative way of finding insights that other people might not be traditionally finding. One great example I saw once was a chocolate company that wanted to identify ways to increase sales outside of traditional seasonality. Traditional seasonality for chocolate is what? Christmas, Valentine's Day, things like that. So what they did was they started to trend conversations using a social listening tool to see when people are talking about breaking up. And based on when that seasonality was, they started to target people with really kind of fun campaigns around eating chocolate. And it was a great way for them to introduce new seasons and really get to increase their sales in non-traditional times of the year. So I think things like that, just being creative and finding ways to see what's going on in the world, tends to be a really fantastic way to identify audience segments, identify sales opportunities, things like that. A lot of times when you're identifying those audience segments to align with your branding campaign strategy, it can be a little bit more of a traditional approach. But if you're taking a broader view and you're really trying to learn different things, it really works out well. A lot of times when I start to work with multiple sets of data and take a more holistic approach, I bring in people. I want to share that work in progress analysis with people because they have the new perspective. They have, maybe a different channel specific perspective. Once you have that broad view, then you can start to drill down into the more channel specific analyses. Generally, when I work to report on a campaign, and I start to gather all of the data, I have a general idea of what I'm looking for based on how we think the campaign did. And I think if you're flexible on what you're learning and you have these hypotheses and you're proving or disproving them with your data, you start to really find a holistic viewpoint that you're able to tell the story from. I think it also helps to set common goals in a customer experience. So again, cross-functional collaboration and understanding what your teammates' goals are for specific channels or specific campaigns is very helpful. In brand strategy, you have to connect all those earned, owned, and paid channel types with the overarching brand goals. So generating brand insights really needs to come from a holistic viewpoint. I think when you are looking at that much data, it's also really important not to take numbers at face value and question how that data was created, how that sample was chosen, what was the methodology like, what was the research experience. A lot of times we know this, like self-reported information, data, or research could be subject to things people don't really know they're thinking. So just sort of questioning it and looking at it from all angles is really the best the best way to do it.
Yeah. And so you mentioning the value of work in progress analyses, I'm just like wondering in your own experience, working with teams, like how does it affect the final outcome, bringing in those new perspectives early on in the process?
There's such a great benefit to that. I think a lot of times when people are compiling data, it feels like because they're compiling it, they have to come up with the solve. Bringing in new perspectives really accelerates that process and provides ownership across the team of what the data is saying and what we can do with it. And so as you go from data gathering to analysis phase, sharing what you're seeing and having that informed discussions, you may learn a different view of what's going on, or you may learn about a different area of the business that you weren't aware of. And that's really going to help inform that holistic brand, consumer-centric journey that we're all looking to build.
Yeah, I love that. And you also mentioned earlier about audience segments and how, like, yes, those can be more of a traditional approach, but I am just wondering what's maybe your approach to identifying the right audience segments and how that aligns with brands or campaign strategy.
I think it's really important to use the research and data you have to understand your customers, but it's also really important to expose yourself to different points of view or be in the place where they are. Like, go shop where they shop, go do what they do, and then tailor your strategy or your tone or your media plan as needed. I think it's also important to understand things outside of the data, like just general, nature versus nurture, life stage versus cohort effects. Anything that you need to do to help you choose your research sample wisely, choose representative samples over ones that might be convenient. I think sometimes it's really tempting to just grab some friends or something like that. But the truth is, I know, like, me and my friends that work in marketing, we're probably not representative of the average consumer. So we look at things way differently. So I think as much as you can to sort of get that real world experience, that's the best way to do it.
Ah, makes sense. So now that we've gone through the process of gathering all these data sources, segmenting your audiences, all of that, it's time for the analysis, right? So could you walk us through what maybe that process has looked like for you?
I think when you're looking at how you can improve a brand's customer experience and drive brand perception in a really customer-centric organization, you've got all your data pieces. You can't analyze it in a silo. I think there's a time and place to drill down into channel-specific analyses, but starting with that high-level or aggregated data, whether that's national, regional, over weeks or months, however that looks like, and then going more into granular data like individual stores, customer transactions, can really help you see the wood for the trees. I think a lot of times, and in the past roles I've had where I worked as an analyst, people ask a lot of questions around the short-term campaigns, the promotions, things like that. And that's granular data. So usually short-term granular data could be exaggerated and underestimates the long-term effects that it might have on a brand. People talk a lot about big data. I like to say long data, for trend analysis, setting up ways to track high-level numbers over time is really useful. And then relating everything into real-world context. So as brand people, we talk about people having relationships with our brand. So what does that look like? Well, how do you build a relationship with a person? You start with a little bit of small talk. Maybe you meet them just, surface level. Then you start to get to know them. You have common interests, common values. Then you decide, like, oh yeah, maybe I want to hang out with them or become friends or get married or whatever you're doing. It's those phases that I think are the phases of the brand funnel and are the phases of the lens with which you look at data. And I also always like to say a brand is not a person, but it is built by people. So it has human qualities. Your brand has a personality. It has, nonverbal communication. It has all of these things that can be informed by the data you're analyzing. And also analyzing data differently is going to yield different results. I recently worked on a campaign where we looked at the top performers. We ran a bunch of ads, a bunch of A/B tests, and we looked at the top performers and we found our winners. And then I dug a bit deeper into some qualitative research overlay, and I saw the reason they were top performers were not the reasons we would want people to want to see our brand. It was very much, they were the top performers because people felt this way. But the second and third tier performers, people actually were saying the things we want people to say about our brand. So we ended up launching not poor performers, but we ended up launching mid-tier performers because it helped us get our brand message across better than just taking the data at face value and launching the top performers. And I think a big piece of doing that is just understanding how to analyze through the context, again, of just how people view brands. I worked as a behavioral scientist for a little while. I worked as a market research for a little while. And ultimately, it seems that you can improve the quality of customer interactions and build brand recognition, no matter what space you're in, by providing these valuable insights on how people experience the interactions, form opinions, create memories in real life, in the context of their day-to-day life. It becomes a great lens with which to view everything.
I'm wondering, then how, the example of choosing a mid-tier performer, I wonder, how that translates to presenting data to other stakeholders and making it actionable when it's, sometimes in the cases of, going against the, the data. But just, can you walk us through your approach when presenting insights to stakeholders?
Yeah, I can definitely give you my general approach, but in that example specifically, we had to start with, the questions we were asking. And that was really important. We needed to know who we were talking to. We needed to know where we wanted to be with them. We wanted to know what we needed to say to get them where we wanted them to be. And so without questions like these, that mass amount of data would have been really hard. With those questions, it helped us to build that narrative for that presentation. In general, for presenting, I'm going to back up. In general, when it comes to presenting data and making it actionable, I'm a big fan of allowing interesting data points to speak for themselves and knowing when this is the right approach. So rather than just putting one big data point on the screen, you definitely want to put it in context, percentages versus absolute numbers, common denominators and metrics, things like that. I feel like the most accessible presentations are the attention-grabbing ones. The ones where people can just at a glance know exactly what you're saying, no matter how complicated the data is. And it's also really important to balance storytelling and thought leadership with intense data analysis and analytical integrity. So for the most part, my slides are pretty simple. They're pretty narrative driven, but every now and then, a slide showing the complicated data analysis that went into that isn't awful. It doesn't mean you have to walk through every little number on the slide, but I think it just shows the approach and the thinking that went into a slide that might otherwise look really simple. And I think when you're thinking of data-driven presentations, a lot of times people think about using data to measure, but it's really also very important to close the loops and use that measurement to inspire upfront strategic and creative thinking with creative teams beyond learnings and best practices. When I worked on the Honda account, I did a lot of presentations of our analytics, of our analysis for the brand, specifically to the creative teams. It was tailored to them to help them understand exactly what creative did well and why. So it allowed us to better inform future campaigns. And eventually, that would all work its way into the brief. And we had a lot of data-driven creatives on that account. So it was very exciting. I think as you continually inform people about the data and the measurement that you're seeing, you start to build confidence in them being able to define and communicate the brand. I see my role very much as I'm in the background. The creative is usually the star, the brand presence, the logo, the colors, all the fun stuff. And if I can be behind those teams, sharing, the experiences and what we feel our consumers want to see, then I feel like that's a success. It allows the team to be more nimble and more customer-centric.
Awesome. You've touched on this a little already. I just want to go a little bit deeper, but how do you ensure that presentations remain accessible and engaging, especially when dealing with complex data and perhaps stakeholders who they're not in the nitty-gritty day-to-day? So are there any techniques that you use to make sure that key data points, stand out without losing any analytical depth or anything like that?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked this because you hear so much that storytelling is important when presenting data. But I think that sometimes that feels like a really elusive concept. So over time, I've really had to figure out how to break down that direction into tangible steps that I can take when building a presentation. The first thing I try to do is write the presentation as if I'm making like an argument to somebody. Consider what I'm asking people to think, what I'm asking them to do. And if I can say that out loud in like one sentence, that's the goal, I think. I also like to consider all factors that would suggest a response from this audience, right? Like data points, connection analysis, anything, any sort of main statement or insight that could have some supporting points. And one of my favorite techniques is to literally sketch it out like a storyboard. Like I'll take a piece of paper, draw a bunch of squares, and I'll make sure that before I even put anything on a slide, like what is it I'm building up to and how am I doing it? And that really helps when I start to get into the slides because then I can focus on the fun stuff, the formatting, the design, and things like that. I feel like it works that way whether you're doing a campaign report or, developing some sort of brief. I think other things to think about is the points that people use to take away certain information. If you have a fact, they're learning it. If you have a truth, they're maybe inspired. If you have an anecdote, maybe that's really memorable. And then I think in terms of like actual formatting presentations, I try to write headlines. So rather than like quarter over quarter growth, it might say like, something to the effect of like, this is what happened this quarter. And it's usually in pretty plain speak, not a lot of marketing buzzwords. It builds the narrative and it lets people know at a glance what any complicated data might be saying. I also try to use a lot of visuals and colors just to indicate, maybe what's happening or what you should be focused on the slide. And it's also important, of course, to vet your narrative to ensure that it flows and it has strong structure. And one way I learned to do this was if you make a slide and you take your hand and you just like cover one part of the slide, if you still know what the slide is saying, you can delete everything that your hand is covering. And I think it's great to use everyday language and just make it accessible,
Yeah, I think some people forget to do that sometimes. And then it's like, oh, it kind of goes over your head sometimes. But I like that, covering your hand over the slide. That's clever. All right, so finally, you stress the importance of using data to not only measure, but inspire creative thinking. So could you expand on how brands can use data-driven insights to inform both the strategic and creative decisions, creating a more cohesive, customer-focused brand experience?
Yeah, I believe that customer-centric brands means taking an active role in defining your relevance to your target audience and ensuring a brand ecosystem touch points all reflect this. If you look at like major brands like Coca-Cola sells happiness, not soda. I was working on Squarespace recently. Squarespace sells creative empowerment, not websites. Great brands sell feelings, not things. And this is just a general, I think, brand 101. Like once people have a strong feeling toward the brand, it increases loyalty, satisfaction, competitive advantage, lifetime value, and ultimately revenue.
I love that. Brands sell emotion. All right. Well, thank you, Susie. This was very insightful for not only me, but I hope for our audience as well. So it's clear that building a truly customer-centric brand goes beyond just the numbers. It's about understanding the deeper human side of data and using those insights to create meaningful connections. So I'm sure our listeners took away a lot from this conversation. So thank you so much again, Susie, and thank you for everyone joining us on another episode of Analytics Unplugged.
To learn more about Buxton, visit our website at buxtonco.com.